Hey guys, I'm going to read to you from two of the resources from the card. They're both fairly short, but they're both really interesting and cover some different aspects of King Henry and the Act of Supremacy. Um, so I'll start with 100 most important events in Christian history. And this one focuses more on the Act of Supremacy. Unlike the German Reformation, England did not originally spring out of the spiritual search of one man who wanted to know God more deeply. It sprang from a combination of personal desire, political expediency, and a nation's spiritual mood. The mood in England had been turning away from the Catholic Church. John Colet, Dean of St. Paul's, had called for reform of the clergy and a return to the study of the Bible. In Cambridge, a group of scholars who affected the teachings of Luther became known as Little Germany. The alarm of the clergy at the spread of reform could not halt it. Yet the King of England, Henry VIII, had little interest in spiritual change. In 1521, he attacked Luther's view of the sacraments and received the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope. His interests in spiritual matters were minimal. After the death of his brother, Henry had married his sister-in-law, meaning his brother's wife, Catherine of Aragon. They had no son to follow Henry on his throne. Attracted by Anne Boleyn, the king sought to rid himself of his unfruitful wife and take a more attractive one who might bear him heirs. Claiming that he should not have married his elder brother's widow, and citing Leviticus 20:21 as his biblical sanction, he asked the Pope for a divorce. He didn't really feel like he shouldn't have married his brother's wife. His thing was that he didn't get a son from Catherine, and he was more attracted to Anne Boleyn, so he wanted a divorce so he could marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope feared angering the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who was Catherine's nephew, and stalled the English king. Impatient Henry appointed Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, and the new archbishop granted the king a divorce. Henry quickly married Anne, and in the same year, 1533, she gave birth to a child, Elizabeth. In 1534, the English Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the King's Highness to be supreme head of the Church of England. That did not mean that the king intended to make radical theological changes in the church. He simply wanted a state church in which the Pope had no authority. The Statute of the 6 Articles, the law that brought uniformity to the new church, continued clerical celibacy, confession to priests, and private masses. However, Henry did suppress monasteries, which had become symbols of hedonism and immorality. The king did not feel the concern of many serious Christians about this. Instead, he coveted the church lands. Once he had shut them down, he confiscated monastery property and put the money into the royal treasury. The lands he passed on to nobles whose loyalty he sought. In the interest of promoting English nationalism, Henry ordered an English Bible to be installed in all churches. Though Henry did not do so for scrupulous reasons, he had created a church that was no longer Roman Catholic. In the years to come, Henry's eldest daughter, Mary, would seek to return England to Catholicism, but it would not last. Once broken from the Pope, the Church of England remained separate. Succeeding waves of Reformation in England were rapid and tumultuous. As will be seen in later chapters, they brought forth a richness and diversity of Christian expression that surely would have confounded Henry. So, King Henry, and I'll show you a picture, he wasn't that great looking. He made all these changes to the church, which ended up actually being good because it brought that out from under the rule of the Pope. It brought the church in England out from the rule of the Pope. But he didn't do it because he disagreed with Catholicism. He did it for selfish reasons, because he wanted to get divorced, because he wanted to take the land from the monasteries. He made these changes for selfish reasons, but God can use even sinful motivations to bring about good things. So that was from this book. Now I'm going to read to you some from this book, The Church in History. And as always, if you watch this and you find anything interesting, go ahead and write a comment on Schoology. The Reformation in England had many peculiarities. One was that in England there was no single great outstanding leader. England had no Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, or Knox. Another peculiarity of the English Reformation was that changes were made in the church in England, not by an officer of the church, but by the king. In the course of history, a strong national feeling had developed in England. The people were against any denomination by a foreigner. During the Renaissance, the papacy had become secularized. It had become more and more interested in the things of the world. To the English people, therefore, the Pope appeared to be a little more than an Italian prince. Consequently, although the great majority of the English people were still good Catholics, they were beginning to resent more and more the rule of the Pope over the Church in England. They did not like to send to Rome all the money that the Pope demanded. In spite of these factors, it is probable that for many years no changes would have been made in the Church in England if it had not been for the fact that the king wanted a divorce. Henry VIII applied to the Pope for a divorce from his wife Catherine. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. Much time passed, and still the Pope did not give his decision. At last, the king's patience grew thin. He made up his mind to take things into his own hands. He was a very powerful king, able to control Parliament. In 1534, he had Parliament pass a law which decreed that the king justly and rightfully is and ought to be the supreme head of the Church of England. This law is called the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Supremacy introduced an important change in the Church of England. It was a change in the Church in only one respect, not in doctrine or form of worship, but in the government of the Church. And it was a change in the government of the Church only in this one particular, that the Pope as head of the Church was replaced by the king. It was a big change, but it could not be called a reformation. Henry VIII regarded Luther as a heretic. As early as 1518, Henry had written a book against heretics called The Seven Sacraments. For that service, the Pope had bestowed upon him the title of Defender of the Faith. When Henry VIII made himself head of the Church in England, in place of the Pope, he did not feel that he had ceased to be a good Orthodox Catholic. Powerful king that he was, Henry could not have pushed the Pope aside if he had not had the support of the nation. The Catholics felt as the king did. They believed that in spite of the change that had been made, they could still be good Catholics. Those who favored the ideas of Luther, on the other hand, looked upon the change as a first feeble step in the direction of the Reformation. But not all Englishmen were willing to submit to the Act of Supremacy. So Henry had another law passed, the Law of Treason and Heresy. This law stated that to hold any doctrines other than those of the Catholic Church was heresy, and to refuse to acknowledge the king as the head of the Church in England was treason. Under the law of treason and heresy, a number of persons were put to death. Monks were executed for denying the supremacy of the king. Two very prominent men, John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, and Sir Thomas More, one of England's more illustrious scholars, were also executed. Both had refused to take the oath of supremacy. For his opposition to the Act of Supremacy, the Pope had rewarded Bishop Fisher by making him a cardinal. A cardinal wears a certain kind of red hat. In a fit of fury, the king exclaimed that he would send the bishop's head to Rome to get the hat. The 76-year-old bishop was beheaded in June of 1535. Sir Thomas More had been a zealous Catholic and had caused many English Lutherans to be sent to the stake. Now the tables were turned. More was beheaded in July. When the king became the supreme head of the Church, the rest of its organization remained what had been when the Pope was supreme head. The Church of England, or the Anglican Church, as it is also called, has ever remained a church governed by bishops under the king as supreme head. Hence, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, is also called the Episcopal Church. Later in the reign of Henry VIII, some changes were introduced in doctrine, form of worship, and certain practices. Monasteries were discontinued, and relics were no longer displayed or regarded as sacred. There were many small monasteries and a few large ones in England. Together, they possessed immense wealth in land and in jewels and gold. That land the king parceled out among his favorites. By doing this, he created a new landed aristocracy, which was very loyal to him. The relics were gross frauds. Among the things that were claimed to have been preserved were a part of Peter's hair and beard, stones with which Stephen was stoned, the hair shirt and bones of Thomas, and the ear of Malchus that Peter had cut off. At Maidstone there was a crucifix which could turn its head, roll its eyes, move its lips, foam at the mouth, and shed tears. When it was removed, a mechanism was discovered inside, which the priests had manipulated. Scattered all over England were pieces of wood said to be fragments of the cross. They were enough to fill 3 carts. The removal and destruction of these things during the reign of Henry VIII was a heavy blow at medieval superstition. England was not a Protestant nation at the close of the reign of Henry VIII. It is perhaps safe to say that in London and the southeastern part of England, the majority of the people were Lutherans, but the west and north of England were still almost solidly Catholic. That included probably about 3/4 of the population. So, those were the 2 books. I hope you learned something interesting. If you did, go ahead and comment that in Schoology, okay?